How to tell if someone is lying to you in just 5 seconds. Have you ever stopped to think that today, someone might lie to you and you might not even notice it? It sounds surprising, but studies suggest that we hear hundreds of lies every single day, from tiny, harmless excuses to things that actually matter. And here's the strange part. The person lying to you isn't always a stranger. Sometimes it could be a close friend, a family member, or even your boss. But here's where things get really interesting. For years, detectives and investigators have used clever psychological tricks to spot when someone isn't telling the truth. These techniques help them notice the small signals most people completely miss. And the best part is, you can learn them too. In this video, I'm going to show you a few simple signs and powerful tricks that can help you spot a lie almost instantly. If you enjoy discovering fascinating psychology secrets like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. The first technique is something I like to call the magic question trick. And honestly, most people never realize how powerful this simple shift can be. Here's the problem. When we suspect someone might be lying, we usually ask very direct and simple questions. Questions like, "Did you go out last night?" Or, "Did you finish the report?" The issue is that these questions are incredibly easy to lie about. A person can simply say yes or no, and the conversation moves on. There's almost no pressure, no thinking, and no opportunity for the truth to reveal itself. But experienced investigators do something very different. Instead of asking questions that allow an easy denial, they ask questions that quietly assume the event already happened. For example, instead of asking, "Did you go out last night?" you might say, "What made you stay out so late last night?" Notice how the question changes the dynamic completely. You are no longer asking whether they went out. You're speaking as if it already happened. At that moment, the person has two choices. They can either tell the truth, or they have to quickly create a story to explain something they may not have prepared for. And that's where things become interesting. Creating a lie on the spot requires a lot of mental effort. The brain has to invent details, keep the story consistent, and make it sound natural at the same time. Most people simply aren't good at doing all of that under pressure. Small inconsistencies start to appear. The story becomes overly complicated, or the person hesitates while trying to build the narrative. That's why this technique works so well. You're not accusing anyone. You're simply guiding the conversation in a way that makes lying much harder than telling the truth. The next technique is called the 5-second rule. And once you understand it, you'll start noticing things most people completely miss. When you ask someone a question, the most important moment isn't the answer itself. It's the first 5 seconds after the question is asked. Those few seconds are when the brain is working the hardest. If the person is telling the truth, their response usually comes naturally because they're simply remembering something that actually happened. But when someone is lying, their brain has to do something much more complicated. It has to quickly invent a believable story, organize the details, and make sure the lie sounds natural. And that mental pressure often leaks out through the body before the person even finishes speaking. That's why those first 5 seconds are so valuable. Instead of focusing only on the words, quietly watch their behavior. Small physical reactions can reveal a lot. Some people suddenly touch their face, rub their nose, or adjust their hair. Others briefly look away, stare at the floor, or pause longer than usual before answering. Sometimes their voice changes slightly. It may become higher, lower, or less steady than normal. Now here's something important to remember. One signal by itself doesn't mean someone is lying. People touch their face or look away for many reasons. But when 2 or 3 of these changes appear together in those first few seconds, it often means the brain is under pressure. In other words, their body may be reacting before their words have time to catch up. That's why experienced investigators pay close attention to this tiny window of time. Those first few seconds often reveal more truth than the entire conversation that follows. Once you train yourself to notice these signals, you'll start seeing them everywhere. And the moment someone hesitates just a little too long, you'll realize something in the story might not be as honest as it sounds. The next technique is known as the baseline method, and it's one of the most reliable tools investigators use when trying to detect a lie. The idea is actually very simple. Before you try to figure out whether someone is lying, you first need to understand how that person normally behaves when they are relaxed and telling the truth. This normal pattern of behavior is what professionals call a baseline. Every person has their own natural way of communicating. Some people maintain strong eye contact when they speak. Others tend to look away while thinking. Some people talk quickly and move their hands a lot. Others speak slowly and stay very still. None of these behaviors mean someone is lying. They are simply part of that person's natural style. This is why judging a lie based on one behavior alone can be very misleading. Instead, the smart approach is to observe someone during a casual conversation when there is no pressure. Pay attention to their tone of voice, the rhythm of their speech, how they sit, and how they move their hands. Notice how often they make eye contact and how comfortable they seem. All of these small details create a picture of their normal behavior. Then, when the conversation shifts to a more sensitive question, watch carefully for changes. For example, imagine someone who normally speaks confidently and looks you directly in the eye. If that same person suddenly starts avoiding eye contact, shifting in their seat, or speaking much slower than usual, that change may signal that something is wrong. The key point is not the behavior itself, but the difference from their usual behavior. Experienced investigators rely on this technique because lies often create stress, and stress naturally disrupts a person's normal behavior patterns. So instead of searching for one universal sign of lying, the baseline method teaches you something much more powerful. It trains you to notice when someone is no longer acting like themselves. The next technique is often called the double-check trap, and it's surprisingly effective because it takes advantage of a simple truth about human memory. Here's the idea. When someone is telling the truth, they are usually recalling a real event that actually happened. The details may not be perfect, but the core story tends to stay consistent because it's based on a genuine memory. They are simply remembering something they experienced. But when someone is lying, the situation is very different. They are not remembering a real event. They are remembering a story they just invented. And keeping a fake story consistent over time is much harder than most people think. This is where the double-check trap becomes powerful. Instead of asking a question once and moving on, you ask about the same event twice, but in slightly different ways and at different moments in the conversation. The key is to make the second question feel natural, almost casual, so the person doesn't realize you are checking their consistency. For example, early in the conversation you might ask, "You went to the movies yesterday, right?" They might say yes. The conversation continues, and 10 minutes later you casually ask something like, "So what movie did you see yesterday?" Now the brain has to keep the story straight. A truthful person will usually answer without difficulty because they are simply recalling what actually happened. But a person who lied earlier may suddenly hesitate, change details, or give an answer that doesn't match what they said before. Sometimes the contradiction is small. Other times it becomes obvious very quickly. That's because lies require constant mental effort to maintain. Each detail has to be remembered and protected. Over time, small cracks begin to appear. The next signal to pay attention to is what I like to call the word trick, and it's one of the easiest clues to notice once you know what to listen for. When people tell the truth, their language is usually clear and direct. They tend to speak with confidence because they are describing something that actually happened. The words come out naturally. For example, someone might simply say, "I was at home last night," or "I finished the report yesterday afternoon." The sentence is simple, steady, and certain. But when someone is lying, their language often becomes softer and less precise. Instead of speaking clearly, they begin to hide behind vague expressions. You may hear phrases like, "I think," "maybe," "probably," or "I guess." At first, these words may sound completely normal. In everyday conversation, people use them all the time. The difference is in when and how often they appear. When someone is trying to avoid committing to a lie, these weak words become a kind of safety net. Instead of saying something definite, they leave themselves a small escape route. For example, instead of saying, "I was at home," they might say, "I think I was probably at home." Notice how uncertain that sounds. The speaker is creating distance between themselves and the statement. It is almost as if their brain is quietly saying, "If this turns out to be wrong, I never fully claimed it was true." Of course, one uncertain word does not automatically mean someone is lying. Some people simply speak cautiously by nature. But when an important question is asked and the answer suddenly becomes filled with hesitation words, it can be a signal that the person is trying to protect themselves. That is why listening carefully to language can be just as important as watching body language. The next sign to watch for is something called the topic switch trick. And once you notice it, you will start seeing it happen in conversations all the time. When people feel comfortable and are telling the truth, they usually stay on the subject of the conversation. They answer the question, add details, and naturally continue the discussion. Their focus stays on the topic because there is nothing they need to escape from. But when someone is lying, the situation often feels very different inside their mind. Lying creates pressure. The person knows that the more they talk about the subject, the higher the chance that something in their story might fall apart. So their brain begins looking for a way out. One of the easiest ways to escape that pressure is to suddenly change the topic. You might notice this happening right after you ask a question that gets a little too close to the truth. Instead of answering clearly, the person quickly redirects the conversation. They might say something like, "Oh, that reminds me. Did you see that funny video everyone is talking about?" Or they might bring up a completely unrelated story. Sometimes they even ask you a question so the attention shifts away from them. At first, this can feel very natural, because people change topics in conversations all the time. But the key is the timing. When the shift happens exactly at the moment a difficult question appears, it may be a sign that the person is trying to escape the subject. In moments like this, the best response is simple. Stay calm and gently guide the conversation back. You might say something like, "We can talk about that in a moment, but I'm still curious about what you mentioned earlier." When the conversation returns to the original topic, watch carefully. If the person becomes uncomfortable or tries to change the subject again, that reaction can reveal more than their words ever will. The next technique is called the interrupt trick, and it works because lying requires much more mental effort than telling the truth. When someone is telling a true story, they are simply recalling something that actually happened. The details already exist in their memory, so even if you interrupt them, they can usually continue the story without much difficulty. They may pause for a moment, but their memory helps them return to the same sequence of events. But when someone is lying, the situation is very different. A lie is not a memory. It is a story that the person is actively building in their mind while speaking. They have to keep track of the details, make the story sound natural, and remember what they have already said. This is where the interrupt trick becomes powerful. While the person is explaining their story, you gently interrupt them with a question about something that happened earlier in the timeline. For example, if someone says they went to the store, you might suddenly ask what they were doing right before they decided to go. Now their brain has to handle two tasks at the same time. They must maintain the story they are telling and also invent an answer to your unexpected question. Most liars struggle with this. They hesitate, change their story, or lose track of the details. And in that brief moment of confusion, the cracks in the story often begin to appear. The next technique is called the fake detail trap, and it's surprisingly simple, yet very effective. The idea behind this method is to intentionally introduce a small detail into the conversation that isn't actually true. It doesn't need to be dramatic. In fact, the more casual it sounds, the better it works. The goal is simply to see how the other person reacts when they hear something that doesn't match the real story. Here is why this works so well. When someone is telling the truth, they are describing something they genuinely experienced. Because the memory is real, they will quickly notice when a detail is wrong. Most people will immediately correct you without even thinking. For example, if you say something like, "So it was raining that day, right?" A truthful person might quickly respond, "No, actually it wasn't raining at all." But when someone is lying, the situation becomes much more complicated. Since their story is invented, they often focus more on keeping the overall narrative believable than on checking every detail. As a result, When you casually add a false detail, they may simply go along with it. They do this because they are afraid that correcting you might draw more attention to the story. Ironically, that attempt to stay safe can reveal the lie. Now you know several powerful techniques that can help you notice when something in a story doesn't quite feel right. The magic question, the 5-second rule, the baseline method, and the other tricks we talked about can reveal small cracks that most people completely miss. The more you practice observing these signals, the sharper your instincts will become. Now I'm curious about you. Which of these techniques surprised you the most? Write the word truth in the comments if you made it to the end of this video. And if you enjoy learning psychology insights like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. I'll see you in the next video.